Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I'll be checking out every Capcom game on the Sharp X68000 computer. X68000 arcade ports have a reputation for being quote-unquote perfect, but are they? A couple of years ago I did a video on every Sega game on the platform if you want to check that one out, and the quality of the ports was all over the place. Will the same be true of Capcom's games? We'll find out. Before I begin, if you've never heard of the X68000, it's a 16-bit computer released only in Japan in 1987. If you've ever seen anything about it online, you've probably heard it called, quote-unquote, the God Computer. But that's a nickname that didn't exist until about 15 years ago as Western gamers discovered the platform. The X68000 cost about $3,000 when it launched, which adjusted for inflation for July 2026 would be over $8,800. A year later, the Mega Drive launched in Japan for about $170 with pretty similar but less powerful hardware. That one adjusted for inflation for today is just under $500. There were upgrades to the X68000 throughout the years, but I'll be sticking with the original for this video, with one exception that I'll tell you about later. Now to clear up some myths super quick, you'll see some claims all over the old interwebs that Capcom based their CPS-1 arcade hardware on the X68000. The highly skeptical, but younger me, may have been suckered by that one years ago, but older, wiser me knows for sure that that's not true. Anyway, the two systems have fairly similar components and capabilities, but the CPS-1 board is still superior in some ways that I'll tell you about during the video. That false or at least distorted claim that the CPS-1 was based on the X68000 probably came from the fact that Capcom used the X68000 as a test environment for their CPS-1 games. Second, there are only 5 Capcom games on the computer. In doing research for this video to be thorough, I was given lists by Gemini and ChatGPT that were 10 to 12 games long with titles that definitely never appeared on the system. I even told the stupid things that they were probably thinking of games on other Japanese computers, and the AI said that I was right after that, and Gemini even apologized for the hallucination. This is why AI is terrible for research right now. It gets a lot of stuff wrong as I write this in July 2026. Anyway, enough of that palaver, let's get on with it. We begin with the arcade version of Ghouls'n Ghosts, also known as Daimakai Mura in Japan. It wasn't the first CPS-1 game, that honor belonged to Forgotten Worlds, but Ghouls'n Ghosts was the earliest CPS-1 game to be ported over to the X68000. For clarity's sake, it was not the first game that Capcom made for the system. And hey, if you're a fan of the channel, you know I love Ghouls'n Ghosts. It's a classic and it is awesome. It's also the easiest game in the franchise by a mile, so it's a great one to start with if you're tearing your hair out over ghosts and goblins. Ghouls was also famously released for the Genesis/Mega Drive and the Supergrafx. I've done complete playthrough comparisons of both systems versus the arcade game if you want to check those out. The links are in the description, and depending on your device, you might see one of them on screen right now. It was also released on a bunch of other platforms with not so great results. Here's the X68000 version, which came on 2 floppy disks. Several people I've talked to about this game didn't realize that it came out for the X68000 in 1994. That's 6 years after the arcade version, 5 years after the Mega Drive/Genesis version, and 4 years after the Supergrafx version. And, well, it's pretty close to perfect, but not quite. And let me preface this next part by saying this port is absolutely fantastic. I'm not going to point out every single difference here, because this isn't a full comparison video. But there are differences. First, the good news. It has all the background scrolling layers and animation of the arcade version, with a soundtrack that sounds incredibly close. Not surprising considering the CPS-1 and X68000 use the same sound chip, Yamaha YM2151. You really have to nitpick to find differences here, and I might do a full playthrough in a future video, but I can call out a few of them now. The main thing visually is that the colors are a little bit different between the platforms. You can compensate for that sort of thing on monitors, so not a huge deal. Next, like any game you're playing from floppy disks on the system, you will obviously experience load times while playing. Now don't mistake me for pointing these things out as serious criticism. This video is about whether things are identical, and for this game, it's super close, but I wanted you to still be aware that there are some things that change the experience a little bit. And the X68000 version of Ghouls'n Ghosts was definitely the best version you could play on any type of home device when it came out. It's also the most accurate of the ports we'll be looking at today, so things are looking great after one game. Yeah, I covered Strider recently in my 6 disappointing sequels video, but here we are again. I mentioned in that video that this was one of my most covered games on the channel, so I'll give you a look at it for just a moment here, but I won't talk about it as much now. Strider was revolutionary and full of set pieces unlike any action game that had come before it. It was and is amazing despite modern naysayers trying to tear it down for some reason. Strider is great, an all-time classic, and anyone who likes fast action games should absolutely play it. It also had a stellar conversion for the Genesis/Mega Drive, and a bunch of not-so-great conversions for other platforms. I've done full playthrough comparisons between the arcade and Genesis version, the arcade and PC Engine arcade card version, and some complete trash episodes looking at the full Amiga and Sega Master System versions of the game. So you have a look and a listen, I'll be quiet for a moment. Strider arrived on the X68000 in November of 1992 on 3 floppy disks. This was about 2 years after the Genesis/Mega Drive version of the game. Is it better? Yes. Is it perfect? No. The differences in this game are more noticeable than the ones in Ghouls and Ghosts. The good news first again, the backgrounds and sprites look very close to the arcade version. Also, it has all the speech of the arcade game. As to the differences, first, look at the top of the screen there. The light bar, score, and timer are at the top of the screen. In the arcade original, these are overlaid on top of the game graphics. On the X68K, they sit in a blank area above a window that contains the game action, just like the Genesis/Mega Drive version of Strider. There are also some places in the arcade version that use that third background layer, like the Starfield in Level 1, which is gone from the X68K port. The background there is just plain black. Both the sound effects and music are also quite different in parts of the game. The music is pretty close, but not quite the same, and some of the sound effects are just noticeably different. Also, there's a lot more flicker in X68K Strider than the arcade version. That's not terribly surprising, considering the difference in sprites between the two systems. The X68000 can only show half the amount of sprites of the CPS-1 arcade game. Also, with this being on 3 discs, be ready for a bit of disc swapping unless you convert it to a hard drive image. Despite all that, this is still a great game and was the most accurate home port of Strider available when it came out. But it's definitely not perfect. I mean, just look at this part, they forgot to put the whole background in. In all seriousness, that was just a one-time glitch that happened while I was recording this. So now it's in the video, and we all win for having seen it. Alright, here's another game from the disappointing sequels video, Final Fight. Again, I'll keep the arcade section brief here, just make sure to get a really good look at it and give it a sharp listen when I shut up. Final Fight was an incredible scrolling beat-em-up released in the arcade in 1989, with gigantic super well-animated playable characters and loads of enemies on screen. It looked, and still looks, absolutely incredible. Despite being a little repetitive, it's my all-time favorite arcade scrolling brawler. The only game in the genre I like better than Final Fight on any platform is Streets of Rage 2 on Genesis, which is my favorite scrolling beat-em-up ever. Really pay attention to the backgrounds, which have a few minor differences here and there, the colors on the timer, and the character icons near the energy bars. And now, listen for a moment. The X68000 received its port of Final Fight on 2 floppy disks, also in 1992, the same year Strider was released. It's amazing to me this game, with its huge characters, tons of animation, and loads of unique tiles, was squeezed onto 2 disks, while Strider required 3. Anywho, X68K Final Fight requires some gentle myth-busting. First of all, this version is great. Let's start with that. It looks really close to the arcade game, but some people call it arcade perfect, and that it is not. Again, I am not knocking it. This was the best version of Final Fight on a home device when it came out, and remained so for several years. The backgrounds are full of color and look really close to the arcade version. The characters are huge and seem to have all of their animation from the arcade original. The music is really close, but like Strider, not quite perfect, which again is a little bit weird considering the X68000 and CPS-1 used the same sound chip, at least for FM sound. Where the X68000 version of Final Fight differs the most from the arcade version is in the area of gameplay, but there are actually a few other things too. Let's start with sprites. The arcade version of Final Fight could have a maximum of 10 characters on screen at once, 8 enemies and up to 2 players, while the X68000 version can only have a maximum of 7 characters, 5 enemies and up to 2 players. Why is this? As I mentioned before, the X68000 supported 128 sprites. It could display up to 32 sprites on any scan line, at least for the original model of the X68000. Capcom's CPS-1 could display 256 sprites at once, all on the same scan line. Technically, the X68000 can display more colors than CPS-1 by quite a lot, 65,536 versus 4,096. In the X68000 version, there are some real subtle differences too. In Stage 2, right before Sodom, there's a light that's lower in the background in the arcade and higher on the X68000. In Stage 3, the lights on the back wall of the bar pulse in the arcade version, while they are completely static on X68K. There's some other minor stuff like that. On the gameplay front, one thing I've always noticed about this version is that it seems like it's way easier for enemies to hit you and interrupt you in the middle of an attack. And a punch sound plays multiple times when you hit multiple enemies with a single punch, which ends up being a little bit strange. The X68K version of Final Fight also allows you to play with an MT32 version of the soundtrack. Final Fight on X68000 is great, but has more obvious differences than the other two games we've looked at so far. It is absolutely not arcade perfect, but again, was the closest we would get for many years for a home release. Here's a game that needs no introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. This is Street Fighter II Champion Edition. It hit the arcades in 1992 and was the first official Capcom update to their monster genre-defining super hit, Street Fighter II. As it happens, Champion Edition is my favorite of the original 3 games. I thought Turbo got a little too goofy. Now, I love the recolored stages, the alternate colors for the characters, the modified moves, and even the janky playable boss characters in this version of the game. Capcom also made some minor cosmetic changes to the characters, like giving Guile defined abs and changing some of the portraits a little bit. This specific version of Street Fighter II also came to the PC Engine in Japan, and I did a full playthrough comparison of that, which I'll link in the description. You can also find Champion Edition as an option in the Genesis/MD Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition, as well as in the Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter II Turbo. Give it a look and a listen now for a moment. Street Fighter II Champion Edition arrived on the X68000 in November of 1993. Since the X68000's controllers typically only had 2 buttons, Capcom included an adapter that let you use Super Famicom or Mega Drive controllers, specifically their fighting stick with this game, so you can have all 6 action buttons. You might think looking at this one that it's arcade perfect. If you think that, well, you're wrong! And this one is very close to the arcade version and requires a lot of scrutiny to find any differences. Having said that, there are some places, if you do look closely, you'll see that there are a few color changes. There are also a few seams where they split scroll layers in a different way from the arcade original. As I mentioned earlier, the X68000 only had 2 scroll layers, much like the Genesis, while the CPS-1 arcade hardware had 3. You'll just notice that there are a few weird scrolling things here and there, but they're very subtle. You really have to look for them. And Capcom really hammed it up with the warning screen when this game starts, mimicking the one you'd see on an actual arcade machine. The main thing that's super weird in this one and gives it away is the sound. The music often has instruments that sound a little extra muffled in this version. And if you play this with FM sound, the normal sound mode, the drum tracks cut out when characters yell their moves or certain other PCM sampled effects play. You win. This is because the computer only had one PCM channel for sample playback. There were some software and hardware solutions for the computer that allowed it to play more than one sample at a time, but you won't find any of those workarounds here. Just as a note, this was not a problem in the Genesis version of Special Champion Edition, which was able to play multiple samples at a time thanks to some software tricks, despite the Genesis only having one sound channel devoted to PCM samples. SF2CE on the X68000 was originally released on 4 floppy disks, so if you want to experience this one like people would have at the time, you're in for some disk swapping. If you want to check it out, I suggest making or acquiring a hard drive image of this one to make it easier to play. If you're wondering why my gameplay looks a little bit weird in this one, I had some trouble getting all the buttons recognized while playing this in X68000 via RetroArch. And this was after even setting the correct options for the fighting stick in the in-game menu. I tried both the Super Famicom and Mega Drive settings, but neither of them worked right and only gave me a total of 3 unique action buttons. Which I may do since I just wanted to show this game off anyway, but I wanted you to be aware if you try this one out for yourself, you might have to do some fiddling with settings. Oh, there's also a MIDI version of the soundtrack. Once again, I don't like it. Maybe you will, so feel free to give it a try for yourself.
Fight!
But overall, Capcom did a fantastic job. Street Fighter II Champion Edition on X68000 is very close to the arcade. Still not perfect, but very close. And here we are at the final game of the episode already, Super Street Fighter II. Super was the 4th Street Fighter II game, coming after the original, Champion Edition, and Turbo. It added 4 new characters in Cammy, Fei Long, DJ, and T-Hawk. The moves for most characters got another round of tweaks, as did the backgrounds which, for the arcade version at least, were completely redrawn, even though the scenes themselves were the same. This was also a CPS2 game, so it was on a more advanced hardware platform than the prior 3 games, along with a much fancier sound chip. Even so, for most of the tracks, I still prefer the original arcade SF tunes to the reworked ones, but there are some exceptions. Now, Super also featured some regressions like the lack of a selectable speed for fights. If you want to see more of this one, I did complete playthroughs of arcade Super Street Fighter II versus both the Genesis and SNES versions of the game in separate videos. If you want to see those full game comparisons, you know where the links are. Anyway, now, give this one a good look and listen. Super Street Fighter II came to the X68000 less than a year after Champion Edition, landing on September 30th, 1994. Super Street Fighter II came on a massive 7 floppy disks and required an upgrade to 4 megabytes of RAM to play it. All the other games we looked at today work on standard X68000 hardware. Now this one is interesting because, as I mentioned, the arcade version was on CPS2, whereas every other game we looked at was on CPS1. Capcom's fancy new arcade hardware was considerably more powerful, even though Super Street Fighter II doesn't really do that much to show it off. Anywho, the X68K version is still really well done. The most obvious change, again, is definitely the music. The sound chip in the X68000 was very similar to the one in CPS1, but not so much the CPS2. So all the music sounds like, well, what the game would have sounded like on CPS1, basically, with one exception I'll get to shortly. Now the colors are once again a little bit different in a few parts of the game. Cammy stage in particular has a few weird seams that are noticeable, I feel. The game still looks great, just a little bit different. The controls also felt a bit less responsive in this one versus Champion Edition on the X68000, which had super snappy controls. Like with Champion Edition, there's more than one sound option. If you go FM, you'll have to deal with the effects and samples cutting out just like they did in the last game, which is the exception I mentioned a moment ago. However, you can set it to MIDI and get a more advanced MIDI version of the soundtrack, which fixes that sound cutting out problem when voices or other effects play. But it leaves you with a music problem where it once again sounds weird and out of place. So whether or not you want to do that, that's up to you. When all is said and done, Super Street Fighter II is still a great port for the X68000 and quite close to the arcade version considering the hardware differences. Alright, and that's all she wrote, folks. So for all those games, they were pretty close. The biggest deviations came from Final Fight because of palette and sprite limitations, and Super Street Fighter II because the original had been on CPS2, which was significantly more advanced than the X68000. Even so, Capcom did a fantastic job with all the games we looked at today. In the end, while the CPS one wasn't based on Sharp's computer and there were significant differences between them, it was still similar enough that it allowed Capcom to create great versions of some of its most classic arcade titles, versions that were inarguably the best available at the time they came out. You just had to really be raking in the bucks to afford the computer that played them. Alrighty folks, your turn. Did any of you have an X68000 back when it was new? Do you have one now? Have you played these Capcom games on it? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. It's the only way to help grow my little channel here. If you haven't, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like Super Thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.